Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me once again. Today, we will be discussing episode number 4 of the Mud Floods, the Great Antarctic Ice Wall. So firstly, I'd like to start off by addressing everybody who's going to sit here and try to tell me that Antarctica is a continent. I'm going to give you 2 points that you must first address before you will ever convince me that Antarctica is what the mainstream media tells us that it is. Firstly, you must explain why there is no north to south circumnavigations done. There are 1 or 2 that have taken place according to mainstream historians. However, if you look at the people that took those explorations, you will soon see that their ties make them nefarious and therefore unbelievable, considering the last person that did it was the cousin of the Queen of England and funded by the Bank of England. So the person that went out there to circumnavigate north to south clearly set out with the motive to confirm what was already known at the time. You will also have to explain to me why the world record for circumnavigating the equator is 1/3 of the time for the world record of circumnavigating Antarctica. You will also have to explain to me why Captain Cook went and circumnavigated Antarctica and came up with measurements of around 60,000 miles. And this is where we're going to start our conversation. Our conversation is going to start with Captain Cook, who in the 1700s set out to explore the southern hemisphere. And one of his main goals was to discover a continent that was believed to be down there, which proved to be elusive, and he could never find it. However, in the process, he shortly discovered, after arriving below the 60th degree parallel, that all of the modern sources and means of tracking your location with longitude and latitude fell apart. They constantly found themselves off of their reckoning by at least 12 to 21 miles, nautical miles. What this means is, at the end of the day, after they wanted to account for where they sailed, they did all of the math and found out they were either 12 miles short or 12 miles further than they were supposed to be on average, and sometimes it was up to 21 nautical miles in distance. So therefore, they were covering a whole hell of a lot more land in some cases than they were supposed to be, or they were not covering as much surface as they were supposed to be. Now, this means that there is an anomaly as far as the longitude and latitude measurements on the heliocentric globe. Captain Cook proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the heliocentric model has no basis in reality. He also proves that Antarctica is not a continent, but rather a great ice ring that encapsulates all of the known continents. Now we're going to take a step back and we're going to look to the year of 1642. Now, according to maps that were produced in 1642, they accurately mapped every known continent except Antarctica down to the point where they had all of the South American continent. They had all of that mapped so perfectly, they understood exactly where all of the rivers and inlets and everything were. They had all of it mapped, every last bit of it. This is in 1642. Yet, they don't account for the continent of Antarctica, and I wonder why. Now, if you take it a step further back to the 1400s, there's ancient Chinese maps that clearly describe land outside of the Great Antarctic Ice Ring that measures 60,000 miles on the interior. Now, if you take into account what Admiral Byrd says later about Antarctica, there is thousands of miles of land that gives way to an area the size of North America, which has been unexplored. Now, if you look at the accounts from the 1400s as literal, and you should, because they have all of the known continents mapped perfectly, they describe there being a concentric ring, the ice ring of Antarctica, right? with a gap of water that houses continents, and then another ice ring. Now, these maps date back to the 1400s, and if they had all of the known continents we know of now, plus the ring of Antarctica that Captain Cook proved to be real later on, we have to assume that they knew what was going on 2,000 years before freaking Captain Cook ever went out and did what he wanted to do. So, we have to assume that these maps are correct, so we must assume that there is more land on the other side of this great ice barrier. And the reason that this pertains so much to Tartarian culture is because the same Chinese culture that devised these maps that tell us about this land on the other side of the ice ring also depict clearly ships sailing over the surface of the earth that don't have any sails of any kind. Rather, they have Tesla towers where we would place a mast on a modern ship, which leads me to believe that the use of this technology goes back far further than anybody could imagine, and its ties to Antarctica as well as the firmament are way deeper than anybody could ever imagine. So we're going to jump to Admiral Byrd and Admiral Byrd's explorations of the southern continent of Antarctica, aka the Great Antarctic Ice Ring, and how it contradicts everything as far as what Google Earth and the modern representations of Antarctica tell us. So when Admiral Byrd went down there for these expeditions, not only were they heavily influenced by our government, they were also privately funded by Masons, the Masonic lodges, okay? Not only did Admiral Byrd go around and talk to the political figures of the time, he also went and had meetings at all of the Masonic lodges before each one of his 3 explorations. Now, he spent the better part of his life, in excess of 30 years, exploring Antarctica. And eventually, he determined that there was a barrier, and shortly thereafter, he was killed. We're going to go back to one of his first explorations, and we have to assume that the information he's giving us in his journals, at least in the early years, is very, very, very accurate. And if you read Admiral Byrd's journals, it's clear to see that later entries were not actually made by him. The writing style's not the same. It's almost as though somebody else takes over at a certain point and things diverge into what the mainstream wants to tell us today. But in reference to a lot of the mountain ranges that he mapped and some of the monolithic structures that he talks about, it's clear to see that he had a better understanding of what was going on down there than modern people of today want to give him. He talks about the Rockefeller Mountains and everything being a whole hell of a lot larger than they appear to be when you put them side by side with what Google Earth is telling us. And I find this very interesting, because if you look at Google Earth maps and where the Rockefeller Mountains are compared to where they're supposed to be in reference to Admiral Byrd's notes, there is a vast amount of this mountain range missing from the Google Earth maps. However, upon further inspection, it almost appears as though half of this mountain range has actually been consumed by ice. Now, what this tells me is, in less than 50 years from when Admiral Byrd went down to the Antarctic ice ring, half of the Rockefeller Mountains have been encapsulated by ice. Now, as soon as Admiral Byrd goes down there and makes all of these measurements and loses all of these men in planes searching for the edge of the known world, he comes back to the United States and he starts doing interviews. Now, one of the first things he did when he came back is he sat down and he met with whoever was in charge of the defense of the United States. And he clearly warned that the United States needs to invest in infrastructure to stop aircraft emanating from the Antarctic region. It is imperative, and it may be detrimental to the national security of the United States. Now, this is very interesting considering Admiral Byrd is also talking around the same time on Long John's chronoscope about an area south of the Central American station that was set up. It was called Central America, which is a station in Antarctica that Admiral Byrd had established. But he talks about a continent the size of the United States that is a vast, untapped natural reserve for all of these natural resources. And he talks about how corporations are going to want to go down there, how the next great war is probably going to be fought over these resources. Now, what's wicked interesting about the beginning of the Admiral Byrd expedition is the fact that it took place during a time where economically the country was not doing well by any means. We're talking the 20s and the 30s, and this man is managing to secure funding in a time where you're either really, really rich or you're really, really poor. There's really no in between. And our economy, we don't know if it's coming back online, right? Even the power brokers probably don't. They're gambling with our economy at this time. They don't know what the outcome's going to be, but they're hoping that they can manipulate it how it was manipulated, right? However, I don't understand how he secured this funding unless there was already knowledge of what existed down there and what he was looking for. Now, if you look at Admiral Byrd's age and how quickly he rose to the rank of admiral, you have to question his motives. And when you look at his ties to the Masonic lodges, it all starts to make sense. So the Masonic lodges have a very interesting belief system as far as the structure that we live in. They are undoubtedly flat earth proponents. If you look at their tracing boards and how they describe people being able to interact with this barrier and move to the other side of it. The Bible talks about this succinctly when they're talking about the book of Enoch. And as far as I'm concerned, that book should be considered canon. Enoch talks about going on the other side of the firmament as well. Now, if you look at the Nazis were down there during World War II, around the same time that Admiral Byrd decided to go down there. So the United States was not the only country interested in Antarctica, and arguably the Nazis spent a lot more resources, time, money, and effort exploring this region. And it is undoubtedly my view that Tartaria and the Nazi culture is 100% interchangeable. And on top of that, I firmly believe that Hitler and Hitler's organization had knowledge that was lost to the rest of the world. You have to come to this assumption when you understand his ties to the Ashkenazis and the Jesuits, as we talked about prior. So, let's just assume that Tartaria, the culture of Tartaria from the 1400s, who mapped the other side of this ice wall, who was tapping into Tesla-like technology, we have to assume that they understood how the firmament worked, because in my opinion, the firmament is the biggest component in the battery that is the Earth. If you think about the Earth, it makes perfect sense to assume that the moon and the sun are an anode and diode. Rahu and Ketu may very well be predecessors to the moon and the sun, and they simply burnt out and they could no longer do their job, okay? And then, you know what I'm saying? Now, you got to look at the ocean as an alkali solution that would provide a conductive material in order to make this work as a battery. Now, the North Pole, according to Tartarian belief, Tartarian culture, is actually emanating an energy, a beam of energy from the North Pole and bouncing it off of the firmament, creating the aurora borealis. This is exactly what the Vikings believe. They go into detail talking about it, and we all know that the Vikings were key to the spread of Tartarian culture throughout the world. Now, if you also tie Tartarian culture and where that culture is supposedly centered on the map, you have to assume when we reference the Tower of Babel that the Tower of Babel is actually talking about the roots of Tartarian culture. Tartarian culture developed from the original tribes that built the Tower of Babel, and that's where the Tartarians inherited their technology from. And if you look at how Tartaria was a confederation of different tribes that spoke different languages that spanned out all over the earth, you can definitely draw a strong correlation between that and the story of the Tower of Babel, and how all of these people were separated into different cultures with different languages after they tried to overthrow the throne of God. And you have to assume that they too were tapping into the same technology, because why else would you build a structure to a firmament that you can't get through unless you thought that you could get through it? So is everything starting to make sense now? The Tartarian culture is the Iron Republic, okay? There is a civilization on the other side of this great ice wall, this great ice ring. It is undoubted in my mind. We have stories of the Iron Republic dating back for hundreds and hundreds of years. And what I find extremely fascinating about these correlations to the Nazi Party is that even in mainstream media today, even in the movies that are being released that reference the Iron Republic, they tie it directly to the Nazi culture. Now, a lot of people believe that Hitler died in Argentina in the 60s. And recently, when they released and declassified the JFK files, right, they say that there's pictures of Hitler in Argentina all the way up until the year 1965. Now, there was a subscriber that was asking me, more or less without asking, how I could justify believing that Hitler turned and went rogue when the government allowed him to live in Argentina. Well, I started doing a little more digging, and I shortly found out that Hitler himself may have very well made it to Antarctica, and Argentina was nothing more than a staging for the armada that went down to Antarctica shortly before the end of World War II. There's a lot of stuff that supports this. Undoubtedly, the Germans did go down to South America and Argentina. One of the biggest populations of indigenous Germans is in South America to this day. German is a predominant language in Argentina. So we know that they were there, but did they stay there? I don't think so. So what I think happened is throughout all of these archaeological expeditions that these guys did down in Antarctica, that the Nazis did, they were down there a lot longer than us, the United States. Undoubtedly, they would have ran into the monolithic structures we've all seen supposed pictures of, right? We all know that more than likely there is pyramids down in Antarctica. But what's interesting about these monolithic structures is, if you line them up over the ley lines on the map, right, they make a whole hell of a lot more sense. Not only over an AE map, they resemble the flower of life. All of these monolithic structures tap into the ley lines. Now, if we assume that these monolithic structures were actually conduits for making this Tesla-type energy, it would make a whole hell of a lot more sense as to what was going on in Antarctica. So, let's just say Hitler and the Nazis managed to figure out how this technology worked. And they went down to Antarctica, and it's undoubted that the United States went and waged a battle in Antarctica against the Nazis. There's accounts of it to this day. And what I find extremely fascinating about that whole situation is that we came back before the job was done. And this ties right back into what Admiral Byrd said to our defense ministry, or whatever you want to call it, whoever's in charge of our defenses about airships. Because there's accounts of the Nazis having allies down in Antarctica that don't come from known continents inside of our system. Now, would it not be very interesting if they managed to figure out a way to get on the other side of the firmament? Now, we all know that it can happen, because you have to take the accounts of Enoch literally, in my opinion. You have to, because everything else he says makes 100% makes perfect sense. And then we have to assume that the Tartarians were living in a flat earth paradigm and completely understood what was going on as far as the maps are concerned. So, let's go back to the original struggle that happened when the Tartarian culture originally collapsed in episode 2. What's going to happen in any war-torn situation? There's going to be refugees, and those refugees are going to use any means of their ability to escape persecution. And if they understand the technology that is the firmament and how to manipulate it and how to get to the other side of it, well, it would stop them from going on the other side of the firmament and just staying there and establishing their culture there and completely eliminating interaction with us. Now, years and years later, Hitler, who came across Tartarian culture and understood what was going on, set out on a mission. And he set out on a mission to discover this lost Tartarian technology. If you assume Hitler had technology that would allow him to interact with this firmament, or at least have a basic understanding of it, what would happen if he made it down to Antarctica, right? And it just so happened that he was trying to establish the culture that was already on the other side of the firmament, right? So they already have that in common. Okay, he's using all of the same symbology, he's using the same morals, he's using everything that culture stood for to represent the Nazi party. Who are the Tartarians on the other side of the firmament going to side with in this situation? So what if they offer the Nazis an offer that they can't refuse at the time? They offer them the same offer that was given to the Tartarians as an option back in the day. You come on the other side of the firmament, but you ain't going back. Doesn't it make perfect sense as to why the United States will go down there, wage this battle, not succeed, come home shortly later, but then we never hear about the Nazis that were down there ever again? It's because they made it on the other side of the firmament, man, and frickin' Tartarians locked the key to the prison again. Makes perfect sense to me. What I'm telling you right now is Antarctica is not what you think it is, okay? The system above your head is not what you think it is. These same cultures that drew these maps that I've been telling you about distinctly talk about other bodies being above our head inside of our system, inside of this concentric ice ring called Rahu and Ketu, okay? And a lot of people that want to sit here and call flat earthers dummies haven't done any research at all, because if they did, they would never ask us why a lunar and solar eclipse can happen inside of this system. It's quite easy to explain. Rahu and Ketu are both dark bodies in the sky, okay? And if you look back at historical records, there's clearly a time in which ancient peoples describe a sky that doesn't have a moon. And this would make perfect sense if you had something acting as an anode or diode up there that wasn't emanating its own energy, Rahu, Ketu, etc. Now, what happens with all electrical systems over time? Components degrade and you need to replace them. So let's just say one of these bodies wasn't able to do its job anymore, so you have to insert the moon into the equation. And once you do this, there's going to be times, and it's always going to happen at the same time if this is set up like a clock, right? If it's a repeating cycle over and over again, it's going to make a whole hell of a lot of sense that Rahu and Ketu are going to show up in the exact position they're supposed to be to create eclipses over time. Now, the reason I can tell you undoubtedly that eclipses are caused by foreign bodies that we don't know about, but the ancients tell us about, is because there are many times in modern recorded history that you can go look up, watch them yourself, where there are eclipses occurring with both the sun and the moon above the horizon visible in the sky at the same time. Now, according to the heliocentric model, this should never be possible, and the only logical explanation is that they are either self-eclipsing or there is other bodies in our heavens that we do not know about that the ancients did that are causing these eclipses, Rahu and Ketu. This all ties together. This all goes back to at least the 1400s. Are we to assume that these men who calculated exactly where all 7 continents are were oblivious to what was going on in the sky above their heads? Are we to assume that Rahu and Ketu were just made up in their minds, or are they actual physical bodies? And if you look at our system as an electrical system, Why is anything that I just went over not possible? And then if you look at the timeline as to when they sealed off Antarctica with the Antarctic Treaty, and if you look into how Admiral Byrd mysteriously had a heart attack, and if you look into how the Nazis that went down there just disappeared, and if you look into how all of a sudden everything changed as far as the shooting missiles into the sky and supposedly trying to ignite the atmosphere on fire, when in fact they were simply trying to get through the barrier with conventional means, which isn't possible. Okay? Why does this technology, every time somebody taps into it, disappear? And I'm going to give you the most logical explanation before ending this video. If I were a member of the ancient Tartarian culture and I managed to escape to the other side of the firmament, I would still have people inside of this system to keep an eye on things. And every time somebody came close to uncovering how to get through this barrier, I would judge the situation and I would figure out if they were of the same kilt of me, if they believed the same things that I believed, if they understood what this technology should be used for. And if they did, I would offer them a way through the barrier, but I would make sure they never went back, ultimately creating a prison. And then at the same time, to screw with the people, because this paradigm is a lot. The flat earth paradigm is old, okay? The heliocentric is rather new. When did it come into existence? When did it come into existence, my friends? The 1900s is when it was pushed wicked, wicked hard. Shortly after the fall of Tartaria. So what if the Tartarians decided we're going to put ourselves on the other side of this barrier and we're going to fucking bury your cities and not allow you to use our technology, and then we're going to change all of your history and trap you into a mental and physical prison, and then we're just going to fuck with you. We're going to make sure that you stay so controlled that you're never going to be a threat again. And anybody that does become a threat, we're either going to offer them the means of coming and joining us, or we're going to get rid of them. This is honestly what I think happened, guys. And this is why we're not allowed into Antarctica today. This is why we will never see or touch that barrier with our own two eyes, our own two hands. This is how it all ties together. In my opinion, this right here may be the very key to discovering everything we need to know. We need to make it to Antarctica, my friends, but it's never going to happen. Even if you had the resources, even if you had the money, I venture to guess that it would be easier to become a citizen of Saudi Arabia as a Christian than it would to be able to go and explore Antarctica unhindered. I honestly think that you'd stand a better chance of getting citizenship in Saudi Arabia as a Christian than exploring Antarctica unhindered. What does that tell you? That tells you that their means of control lies in that region. I'm offering you my best explanation. Thank you for liking, subscribing, sharing, and becoming a member of this community, man. It's growing quicker than I ever would have imagined. It definitely is. Have a great weekend, guys.